In this video, I'm going to finish up that Ashandarei spear sword. Previously, I already constructed the blade and created the spear shaft that's engraved and already painted up. So now we're ready to finish the sword blade and put it all together. If you missed any of the previous work on this, you can just follow that card above and get caught up. But now we're going to jump right into getting that blade ready to paint. The first step is going to be to clean off any little imperfections in the 3D printed portion. I'm just using a wood burner with a nice flat tip on it that makes it easy to clean out the fine lines and also to smooth out that joint where the two pieces were attached together. Now that the pieces are as clean as I can get them and the blade has been fairly well sanded, I'm going to clean it up even more by using some of this wood filler that you can just smooth on nicely. It's a lot like frosting a cake. And just clean it up as much as you can with this, keeping it nice and neat as much as possible. It helps to kind of do this in layers instead of trying to do one thick, perfect layer. Just put on a thin layer, kind of like that crumb layer that just keeps everything from getting mixed into your frosting. Gets it started out being smooth, and then you just build up layers on top of that until you have the texture, or in this case, the lack of texture that you're going for. I'm using the side of a paint stirrer to kind of take off some of that excess in a nice smooth way. And then just building up layers obviously on both sides. Since it is a double-sided weapon, you have to do everything twice. Although luckily, with 3D printing, I didn't have to design the decorative portion twice. Just design it once, print everything twice in reverse. It's pretty good. Now this is a very advanced tool that I'm using to apply the wood filler. It is one of those fancy butter knives that nobody ever uses out of their utensil set. I found a use for it. Works pretty well for this. Now you just gotta let it dry for a while. It dries fairly fast, and then it's ready to be sanded. And sanding is really messy, so that's why I'm doing it outside. It really gets everywhere, and you're not really supposed to breathe this dust, so definitely do it in an area that can just get messy and have all the dust blow away. I'm using first, of course, a more coarse grit sandpaper to get off the biggest ridges, and then moving down to a finer grit sandpaper. Of course, this stuff's pretty easy to sand. It's not too bad. Once it is nice and smoothly sanded, we can go in with a couple of coats of wood glue that's been thinned down. I'm hoping that this will be enough for me to be able to sand it nice and smooth, just using wood glue without having to use a filler, but we'll see how that goes. It's a little bit of a pain working it into all the crevices of the 3D printed portion, so hopefully that will be a good choice, but again, we'll see. And then once that's thoroughly dry, go back in with sandpaper. I just, as usual, started with 220 grit and then switched over to 400 grit to get that as smooth as possible. And it seems pretty okay at this point. Make sure you get off any sanding dust, and then you're just going to kind of get an idea of how this is going to look with the spear shaft. And I noticed at this point that the tip just was a little bit too long and sharp. I don't want this to actually be dangerous, so I'm just going to trim it down a little bit, round it off slightly, and not worry too much about getting it perfectly smooth there, because it's going to be, weathered and battle scarred and whatnot later on anyways, but still just try to kind of get it a little bit neatened up without it being lethally sharp, and then just add a little more wood glue to make it a little bit stronger. So now for some reason I was thinking it would be good to start out with this, I think, a chestnut color spray paint to kind of give it a warm undertone. I don't think this is really going to actually end up showing, but it was worth a try. Just experimenting, but it is kind of cool to start seeing this all in one color now. You can really see it as a single piece instead of as the separate printed and foam parts. Over top, I'm using silver, and then I'm going to do some gold over top of that just to make it a little bit warmer. Again, that silver spray paint, it looks a little bit kind of fakey at first, but the gold warms it up, makes it look a little more natural, and then we're just gonna Gucci goo. Now at this point, okay. So yes, I just painted it and everything, but I was not happy with the level of smoothness that I had achieved, or lack thereof. So I had the brilliant idea of just going in with some automotive filler primer over top. It had dried for a couple of days, so I thought it would stick just fine. Well, I was wrong. So then I had to spend quite a few hours cleaning the filler primer out from between the 3D printed parts because it just didn't adhere. It was cracking. It looked like that crackle finish. Just not what I was going for on this. So I ended up getting through probably a season and a half of rewatching Breaking Bad, just fixing that error. But now I know for future, filler primer won't necessarily stick to everything, so do a test area and don't try to put it on too thick at once, It's always bad to be in a rush at that stage of painting and filling and whatnot, and that's always when I want to just get it done. I ended up having to basically scrape it deep enough to take off even the wood glue underneath. It turns out it didn't actually adhere very well to the 3D printed portion, so note for future projects, putting the wood glue over the printed portion in addition to the foam portion is just not the best idea. It's not going to adhere very well, at least on semi-flex. It's time to add some battle scars, which is a little bit of a nerve-wracking thing to do. Just go in and start hacking at the project you just spent all this time getting smooth. But for one thing, it's going to help disguise basically any slight imperfections that I've already spent enough time cleaning this thing up, so I can't put any more time into making it smooth. So instead, I'm going to make it look awesomely battle scarred. So just using that Dremel extension as usual, it gives you a nice flexibility and maneuverability to just go in and start taking chunks out in areas that you think might make sense, that would have been, hacked at if you used this to block another weapon strike or something. Might take a chip out of the edge. You might use it to block something because it's wide enough to be a little bit of a shield. You could just block somebody's sword stroke with it, maybe deflect things and end up taking little chunks out of it. And of course you want to take the slash marks all the way through from the foam portion through to the 3D printed portion because we want it to look, like one piece. The filler primer on the foam portion, it did actually work quite well. I was able to sand it and then do a final wet sanding, and it gave it a really nice, soft, smooth finish that's going to contrast nicely with the battle scars. Once the distressing is finished, just do some final sanding on there because it does leave some little scraggly edges, and I'm just using a little bit of water on there to get the smoothest finish possible and everything. That wet sanding is a really nice step to take on there. Gives it a little bit of a extra smooth finish. And of course you got to just make sure to remove all sanding dust in preparation for painting the second time. The raven part in the center there, actually it ended up being a little bit of a pain. In retrospect, I would have actually had the 3D printed part cover that, not do it as a cutout that has the foam showing through, because it was really difficult to try to get the foam to have a nice smooth finish. For some reason it got a little bit lumpy and I couldn't sand it very well because it is recessed. So in future I'm just going to have it be a recess that doesn't cut all the way through. On those cuts, I did have to put a little bit more wood glue because they had the bare wood filler, and that's a little bit powdery. I don't think the paint would stick super well, so I just filled it in with the wood glue to make sure that it has a good surface to bond to. And then again with that raven, like I was saying, it was just a little bit lumpy, and I couldn't fix it with the automotive filler, so I just added a little bit of extra wood glue to kind of level it out as much as possible. Then I did the same technique as I did the first time with the silver spray paint with a little dusting of gold spray paint. And I've already done that one side there just so you have something to compare it to. It really makes a huge difference, this detail painting. Starting out, I'm just going to use black to fill in these recessed areas. And I'm not going to do just a solid black though. It works really nicely to brush the black acrylic paint on and then dab it off with a damp paper towel. It gives you kind of a textured metal effect, maybe dirty metal or hammered metal. It looks a little more interesting than just painting it solid black. And as you fill in like the dice and whatnot, it really starts to bring out all of those details that I've worked so hard to add and keep clean and sand multiple times. And it's also the time to start bringing out the distressing marks, those sword slashes and whatnot. You don't ever want to do it too heavy first time around. It's a lot easier to add additional layers than to put it on too thick the first time around, and then you lose that metallic finish that kind of shows through. And here around the raven, I want to actually even bring out the metallic a little bit more, so I just kind of burnished it a little bit, just polished off a little more of the black paint kind of around the edges, because the darker portions are going to be more in the cracks and crevices anyway, so kind of raised areas in the center would be a little bit cleaner, maybe a little bit shinier, and polished off from use and cleaning over the years. On the dice, I really like kind of the look where it's darker around the edges and lighter towards the center. It gives it a little more of a dimensional look, but with the little triangle cutouts between them, I am getting those all the way black, partially because they are a little bit rough inside because of that filler primer that I couldn't really get out very well because it was on foam, so if you try to scrape it, you end up poking into the foam, and it's just not good. So painting it black resolved that issue, and it looks really nice. It's a nice contrast to the bright silver of the accent edges around the dice, and then the distressed aged silver that the dice are starting to look like now. To make it a little bit less flat looking, I'm just using this beautiful bright blue color, but very watered down, and just dabbing it in on select areas, brushing most of it off. It just looks a little bit more interesting, like different reflections in the silver instead of just being silver and then this flat black. Same for some of the slash marks, just add a little bit of that blue in there to liven it up a little bit. Then we need to seal everything in. I'm using my favorite glossy automotive sealer on this. It's very tough, it dries well, just don't do it too thick the first time around and end up getting drips. That's always a bad idea. There's just a little bit more prep work to do on the pieces for the spear shaft. The coupling is a little bit too long at this side now that I've got it together with the blade, so I'm just trimming it down a little bit, just sawing off some of that edge. We're still going to have enough threading to attach it together just fine, but it's going to be a little bit more flush when it screws into the lower portion of the pipe, and not put the upper portion with the sword too high so that it's above the coupling. We want the coupling to actually cover the joint between them, and then there's just a little bit of a gap there, so I just filled it in with some scrap EVA foam, just hot glued that in place. The lower coupling I want to permanently attach to one side of the spear shaft. Obviously, you don't want to glue it to both sides because then you won't be able to take it apart, which completely defeats the purpose of having the joint there. So I used Gorilla Glue for that. You just mist it with a little bit of water, stick it together, and it is permanently bonded. You're not going to get that thing apart. Time for final grimy distressing here. So I'm using more warm tones. I've got this really nice kind of rusty color that I've been using quite a lot. I really like it, along with just some classic burnt umber and black to give you some nice variations. Just kind of dry brush on some areas and just work it in as if it's just the grime of life. You're out on the battlefield, it's going to get dirty, it's going to collect in the edges and around different coupling points. Just work at it until it starts to look like it's been well used. But maybe, you cleaned it a couple times, but you didn't get quite to the edges and then it got dirty again. I want to kind of continue that effect all the way down, because it wouldn't be just the blade here. It's going to be the joints of the spear. We don't want it to look like it comes apart, because that would be a little bit silly. It's supposed to be, a wooden pole here for the spear shaft. So we're going to pretend like this is permanently attached, and so then we would get grime buildup along the edges of the coupling too. So just use those same paints and just start building up the same kind of layers of grime on the spear shaft so it all looks cohesive. It also helps to bring out a little bit of the wood grain texture that we put in with the Dremel last video. And I'm just going to keep building up those paint layers until I am satisfied. And it looked like it just needed a little bit more of a dark tone on the bottom and top edges of those couplings to make them just look a little bit less separate. They stood out a little bit too much. So darkening the edges makes them look cohesive and like they've been used with the spear shaft as opposed to being added on later like they were. And just carefully adding some more just continuing this all the way down to the bottom, and then I do need to attach the final end cap. First I'm just kind of doing the same thing to that piece, and I'm going to use the Gorilla Glue again to make that permanently attached. That piece doesn't need to be able to come off. I didn't put it on yet because I didn't want to be banging it around while I was painting the pole. So there we go. It is going to never come off now. I put a little too much Gorilla Glue. I really like Gorilla Glue, but it does get a little messy if you're not careful to use just a little bit. But that's okay. I'm covering up any excess glue with some grime anyways. It's very useful stuff, dirt. That's it. It's finished. It is ready for JordanCon. And it's actually quite lightweight. It worked really well using the PVC, the foam, the carbon fiber rod. Everything worked together quite well. I didn't want this to be heavy because nobody wants to carry around this super heavy prop all day at a con. As always, thank you for watching. And if you have questions or comments, go ahead and post those below and let me know what you think of this project now that it's all done. If you haven't already subscribed, you should probably do that now. You can catch the fox head medallion later on, and I've always got like 3 other videos that I'm trying to get to at any one time, so I post as often as I can. I try to keep it about every other week, but sometimes it's a little more, sometimes it's a little less, just because the variety of projects that I do, they take such different amounts of time depending on what they are. I'm hoping to get some pictures of this with the full costume, so I'll post those at lindydesignlab.com once I have some. See you soon!